Guten Abend, liebe Studierende. Ich werde langsam anfangen mit unserer Ringvorlesung. Heute ist es ein bisschen aufregender als sonst, denn heute wird der erste Online-Test freigeschaltet. Und dazu mache ich gleich eine kleine technische Einführung, damit es nicht zu großer Verwirrung kommt und deswegen vielleicht 4 Credit Points sausen gelassen werden oder so. Außerdem wollen wir aber vorher noch aufmerksam machen auf eine Aster-Veranstaltung, nämlich den Gastarbeiterinnen-Monologen. Da wird, glaube ich, gleich im Chat noch was geschickt, nämlich das Datum und wo es genau stattfinden wird. Außerdem wollen wir noch hinweisen, das ist jetzt spezifisch für die Studis an der HAW, dass ihr euch bei MyHAW für die Tests anmelden müsst, weil die euch sonst nicht angezeigt werden. Das Gleiche gilt halt auch für die TU. Aber ich würde jetzt einmal schnell weitergehen in eine Präsentation. Dann seht ihr das nämlich alles viel besser. Mal freigeben. Also, wir beginnen mit dem allgemeinen Teil, nämlich der Übersicht, wie es an den ganzen Hochschulen verschieden aussieht. An der Uni Hamburg haben wir oben OLAT. Dort könnt ihr unter diesem Reiter Online-Tests die Online-Tests abrufen und dann auch bearbeiten. An der TU ist es über Elias. Den Elias-Link kriegt ihr auch über den Reiter über StatIP. Da könnt ihr halt entweder über diese Verlinkung gehen oder halt oben. Und dann haben wir das nochmal an der HAW über Emil. Da könnt ihr auch unter dem Reiter Online-Tests dann an den Tests teilnehmen. So. Wann und wie viele Online-Tests gibt es? Wahrscheinlich ist es schon bekannt, dass es 4 Online-Tests geben wird. Und zwar an diesen Daten. Wie ihr seht, wird heute der erste Test beginnen. Diese Tests werden jeweils eine Woche lang zur Verfügung stehen und freigeschaltet sein. Ihr könnt immer nach der Ringvorlesung um 20 Uhr beginnen und dann läuft der Test bis kurz vor der nächsten Ringvorlesung, also um 18 Uhr. Ich glaube, das ist sehr selbsterklärend. Der zweite Test ist, glaube ich, leicht verschoben wegen Pfingsten, also nicht wundern. So, jetzt zum Aufbau der Online-Tests, damit ihr wisst, was auf euch zukommen wird. In jedem Online-Test werden zwischen 10 und 12 Fragen gestellt werden. Wir geben uns Mühe, dass meistens so circa 30 Punkte vergeben werden können. Da gibt es natürlich manchmal auch Abweichungen. Das kann halt manchmal passieren. Diese 10 bis 12 Fragen werden 3, manchmal 4 Vorträge umfassen. Und ihr werdet pro Online-Test 2 Versuche haben. Dabei wird halt immer der erste bestandene Versuch gezählt. Also wenn ihr den ersten Test schon bestanden habt mit der Hälfte, dann wird der zweite Versuch nicht freigeschaltet werden. Falls ihr nur 14 von 30, also ein bisschen weniger als 50% der Punkte erreicht habt, dann wird der zweite Versuch freigeschaltet werden. Wo könnt ihr dann die Testergebnisse nachgucken? Die Testergebnisse sind immer nach Ablauf der Testphase ab 20 Uhr für 24 Stunden einsehbar. Das bedeutet, also nach der Ringvorlesung um 20 Uhr bis den Folgetag Mittwoch auch 20 Uhr. Angezeigt wird dann euch, und darauf müsst ihr dann achten, die Punktzahl, die ihr erreicht habt, die eigenen Antworten und die Musterlösung, also was vielleicht auch wichtig und interessant für eure Weiterbildung ist. Wichtig ist, dass ihr bei dieser Punktzahl halt darauf achtet, dass es wichtig ist, dass ihr, um diesen ganzen Kurs zu bestehen, dass ihr 50% der Gesamtpunkte erreichen müsst. Das heißt, dass alle Tests genommen werden in dieser Rechnung. Wieso ist das wichtig? Weil es ums Bestehen oder Nicht-Bestehen geht. Da haben wir jetzt so eine kleine Beispielrechnung gemacht. Wenn ich jetzt im ersten Test nur 14 Punkte erreiche von 30, also weniger als die Hälfte, dann habe ich zwar nicht bestanden. Wenn ich aber im zweiten Test richtig gut abschneide und sehr viel mehr als 50% bestehe, also mit 26 Punkte, dann werden 14 Punkte und 26 zusammengerechnet und zu 40 Punkten, und 40 von 60 Punkten sind mehr als die Hälfte, also habe ich bestanden. Also so ungefähr könnt ihr euch die Rechnung vorstellen, und ja, ich glaube, das ist selbsterklärend. Trotzdem wollen wir euch noch einen kleinen Ausblick geben, weil das auch immer wieder verwirrend war, was passiert, wenn diese ganzen 4 Tests vorbei sind. Nachdem der 4. Test vorbei ist, werden die Ergebnisse veröffentlicht. Das ist dann halt auch an der Uni Hamburg auf Stine der Fall, an der HAW, MyHAW und bei der TU wird es Tune sein, wo wir die Noten eintragen. Das kann halt eine Weile dauern, weil wir haben 2700 Anmeldungen zu dieser Ringvorlesung und das muss alles händisch eingetragen werden. Deswegen wichtig, in dieser Zeit werden keine individuellen Anfragen beantwortet. Wartet einfach, bis die Ergebnisse kommen. Wir schreiben auch dann eine E-Mail, wenn wir fertig sind mit dem Noteneintrag. Ja, das könnt ihr euch dann auch alles angucken. So, wenn jetzt der Fall eintretet, dass ihr, wie eben vorgerechnet, mehr als 50% der Punkte erreicht oder halt 50 Punkte, dann habt ihr diese Veranstaltung erfolgreich absolviert. Falls es aber jetzt passieren sollte, dass ihr aus irgendeinem Grund weniger als 50% der Punkte erreicht, habt ihr die Möglichkeit, an einem Nachschreibetermin teilzunehmen. Dafür müsst ihr euch dann halt auch wieder rechtzeitig anmelden bei Stine, MyHAW oder StatIP bzw. Tunes. Da kriegt ihr aber auch wieder Mails, die euch dann daran erinnern werden. Der Termin steht noch nicht fest. Wir gehen ja jetzt erstmal auch davon aus, dass alle diese 4 Tests bestehen werden und kein zweiter Nachschreibetermin überhaupt notwendig ist. So, was sind unsere Tipps zur optimalen Vorbereitung für die Tests? Wir schlagen euch vor, dass ihr alle Unterlagen für die also wie zum Beispiel die Vorlesungsfolien vor Testbeginn runterladet und dann öffnet. Zum Beispiel könnt ihr auch noch zusätzlich die YouTube-Videos öffnen. Und dann, wenn ihr den Test bearbeitet, guckt, dass ihr eine stabile Internetverbindung habt. Am besten auch am Computer und Laptop bearbeiten, nicht am Tablet, nicht am Handy, weil da ist das anders konfiguriert. Wir empfehlen euch, dass ihr euch einen ruhigen Zeitpunkt aussucht für den Test und idealerweise auch in einem Durchgang dann abarbeitet. Also es wird wohl auch möglich sein, den Test kurz zu unterbrechen, aber wir empfehlen nicht länger als eine Stunde oder eine halbe Stunde, das einfach nur offen stehen zu lassen. Denn wenn er unterbrochen wird, dann werden die Ergebnisse nicht gespeichert und auch nicht abgeschickt. Deswegen immer darauf achten, dass die Testantworten abgesendet werden und dann nicht irgendwo stecken bleiben. So, wenn das dann am Ende dieser Ringvorlesung ist, dann wünschen wir euch viel Erfolg und hoffentlich schafft ihr die Fragen zu beantworten. Falls ihr immer noch Fragen habt und weder auf OLAT noch auf E-Mail noch auf StatIP Informationen findet zu diesen Fragen, dann fragt doch eure Kommilitonen in zum Beispiel diesen Austauschgruppen auf WhatsApp und Telegram haben wir Austauschgruppen. Falls da immer noch keine Antworten sind auf eure Fragen, dann schreibt uns gerne eine Mail an ringvorlesung@asterunihamburg.de. So weit, so gut. Ich gehe wieder zurück. Achso, jetzt muss ich noch die Aufnahme stoppen. So. Entschuldigung, ich muss zu meinem anderen Bildschirm kommen wieder. Nämlich möchte ich jetzt weitergehen zur Einleitung des Vortrags. Nämlich, we are very happy and very proud to welcome Dr. Danielle Ignace of the University of British Columbia. Danielle is not our ordinary forest and conservation plant physiologist, ecologist, and ecosystem scientist with a passion for science communication. No, she's also specialized on how global changes affect communities of color. Danielle herself is a Native American of the Coeur d'Alene and is committed to integrate and manifest indigenous voices and in natural science. We are very interested in her work and look forward from her to give us an insight into broadening our approach to find community-driven solutions to environmental changes. And with that, I would like to give you the stage, Danielle.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. I will assume that you can. Oh, thank you so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me to share a little bit about my work with all of you. I see that there's a lot of you online, and I didn't quite hear everything before the introduction. But I hope your class is going well. And I just want to offer up on the slide, you can see ways to get in touch with me. There's a QR code at the bottom left that will quickly take you to the Ignace lab online. I'm also on Twitter, also on YouTube, where I try to have videos that try to bring science to the general public and make science accessible. And today I'll be talking about 3 different projects, but I do want to emphasize that these are community engagement focused projects, or projects that aim to have community driven solutions. I do have a really broad set of research that is not at all mentioned in today's talk. I focus a lot on carbon exchange and carbon storage of various ecosystems, especially forest ecosystems. This ranges from Massachusetts in the Northeast United States all the way to the area now that I live in, which is British Columbia. So if there are questions at the end and you'd like to talk about some of that work, which has primarily focused on the loss of eastern hemlock trees and what that means for changes in carbon storage, I'm more than happy to address some of those questions as well. Okay, so I do like to start by telling you about my identity and how that influences the work that I do. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I am a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe. This is a picture of my parents on the top left. My father grew up on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation in northern Idaho. My mother grew up in the Menominee Reservation in northern Wisconsin. That is my grandfather on the bottom left, who until his passing, we would go and visit quite often in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and it was always an adventure to get there because we were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So myself and my siblings here, Glenn, Lyle, and Tekla, grew up, born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is in the upper Midwest United States. And we grew up in a family that was devoted to enhancing healthcare for Native Americans in urban settings. My father established the Gerald L. Ignace Indian Health Clinic in downtown Milwaukee to address this particular issue. And my brother currently is the chief executive officer for the clinic. My mother was also very active in the arts and serving on board of directors for different groups to address how do we kind of amplify Native American voices in the arts as well. So I grew up with this kind of mixing of science and medicine and the arts, and I think that's really greatly influenced what I am passionate about today. And so that's me with my family here. We do identify as Coeur d'Alene and Menominee. And a little bit about the shortest version of how I got to where I am today. As I said, my father and my brother are physicians. They are specializing in internal medicine. And I thought I would do that too, kind of follow in their footsteps and I guess contribute to the legacy of my father of wanting to contribute to this idea of improving healthcare for Native Americans. But what's a fun story is that when he was much younger, this is him in the upper right corner a long time ago, but when he was in northern Idaho, growing up on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, really wanted to protect forests. He was really enamored with the Douglas fir forests that were in the area. And of course, this area is subject to various wildfires. So he became a smoke jumper to essentially jump out of airplanes, fight wildfires on the ground. But this didn't last long because, as you can imagine, it is quite grueling work and he just simply couldn't maintain his weight. So thus ending his days as a smoke jumper and became a physician instead. Whereas I grew up in Milwaukee wanting to be a physician. And what we hear often in undergrad years is in order to get into medical graduates program, this one was at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. Essentially, this is where I fell in love with forests, mountains, and just knew that I had to embark on a career that allowed me to address really big questions in a sense, how do we address climate change? Why are species where they are, and how do they interact with each other? So that was the big turning point in my career. That was a long time ago, 21 years ago. But that's it's a fun circling back full circle story to this is that in a recent conversation with my father that he said, well, if he never became a physician, that he wanted to become a forest ecologist. So I say all this to say, I guess encourage everyone to broaden your experiences, because you never know where it might lead you into finding your new career path and passions, and that in the end you'll do great things, and maybe it's what you were meant to do all along. So that's me on a personal level. I do like to start with this just so you can see where I'm coming from in terms of my perspective, as well as my identity and how I include my cultural identity with the work that I do today. And as I said, I'll be talking about 3 different examples of community engagement. The first one goes back to my days when I was a graduate student and a postdoc at the University of Arizona, which is in Tucson, Arizona. Very arid, hot and arid desert environment. And here I was on the board of directors for a nonprofit organization that was working to protect biodiversity in the Southwest of the United States. The second project I'll be talking about environmental justice. And this is a very new project. We're in the second year of this, but this focuses on community engagement in order to address environmental justice or injustice in Houston, Texas. And third, I'll be talking about, again, more recent work that addresses issues relating to Indigenous communities and the research that happens on the land of these Indigenous communities. And this work is done in Petersham, Massachusetts. So the first topic here, during my postdoc years in Arizona, I was on the board of directors for Native Seed Search. If you're not familiar with this, you could easily Google them and find them online, and you can see a beautiful website and that describes their story and how they started and the different activities that they do. But it's really all about protecting biodiversity. And in this case, really protecting the heirloom crops that are in the Southwest, in a sense, in a way to protect biodiversity, conserve all the seeds, and as well as addressing food security and climate change. So if you go to the website, you'll see all kinds of information about how they started, how they save seeds. A lot of work goes into an organization like this. This is essentially a seed bank. And if we were in person, I would probably ask the entire audience to say, who's heard of Svalbard, the Global Seed Vault, which is in Norway, and to see if you're familiar with that. Every once in a while, you'll see that Global Seed Vault on the news, in a sense to address climate change. I believe one of the last stories I saw about it a couple of years ago was about the melting of some of the ice and snow there, and that they were concerned about the seed bank, I guess, being up and running still, but it is fine. And it is a global seed vault, right? And so there are many different smaller versions of these kinds of seed vaults around the world. And this is one of them. So this is a seed bank for these Southwest heirloom adapted, arid land adapted crops. And this really has a fantastic journey of interacting with the Native American community in Arizona and to where they are today. So I'm no longer on the board. So this is not a pitch at all to have you donate, but this is just to show you some examples of how it came to be and what I think is a good and healthy and respectful way to engage with communities in order to address conservation of these seeds and biodiversity. So they are a seed bank. They also distribute these seeds. They do have a public-facing storefront so that you could go in and purchase them. You can order them online. They also have a seed exchange program. They also have ways to become a member, which I guess gives you special privileges. They also, interacting with the Native American communities, you can come in and get seeds for free. And that is because the Native Americans that are in the area had originally had these seeds, and now that they can use them to, as a way to conserve their cultural identity and cultural uses of these seeds and plants. There's also various supporting growers activities. They have a lot of education to community members. They have community gardens that they help to set up. There's also botanical research, right? So to have a seed bank, of course, anyone could technically have a seed bank, but this is difficult work. In order to keep this going, you have to store them and make sure that they're in an environment where they can be stored over the long term and be viable, but also you need to make sure that they remain viable. So you need to grow them out every once in a while. So there is really a group of conservation scientists that help to do this. And this is just a snapshot of the hundreds and hundreds of varieties that they have. These are really beautiful examples here. And of course, thinking about corn, beans, and squash as the three sisters, and how important this is to this area. So the Tohono O'odham Nation in this particular area was so incredibly important for the start of this seed bank. And this really kind of addresses how scientists or those that want to embark on establishing a nonprofit organization, as well as the Native American groups that are in the area, might have the same goal, but in a sense, they came together because they were all searching for the same thing. They were searching for seeds, the heirloom seeds that are adapted to these arid land environments. And so what ended up happening were many conversations, decades ago with the Tohono O'odham Nation, that they were searching for seeds that were important to them, both in terms of sustaining their health, and addressing food security, but also seeds that were culturally important to them. And so this began a decades-long journey of having now hundreds and hundreds of seeds, not just a few seeds that they wanted and felt were important, but now it's so many different varieties that are found at the seed bank. And so here's an example on the top left of course, you could have your own seed bank and store seeds in a jar, but then the bottom left there, that it shows some of the different ways in which it's stored in this cool, controlled environment in order to help preserve these seeds. And of course, there's a lot of science that goes into this. And I bring this up because I often said, and a lot of my Indigenous scholars and colleagues often say that these communities are the original scientists, and that they may not have technically a degree to show for that, but the amount of work that is required to have successful and sustainable farming requires a ton of science, right? In order to know how the seeds are kept viable, when can they germinate, what kind of environment is just right for them to germinate, survive, and grow, and then reproduce. And so this is really, since many thousands of years, why this is important to, I guess, keep all of these seeds as a way to preserve cultural identity, but also the biodiversity in a sense that will be important as we go forward. So this is all important work. It still continues today. In a sense, this work never ends, right? We are in the middle of an incredible climate and nature emergency. So how do we address this? There's no one way to address this. And in this sense, this also addresses an issue where accessibility or having the information of climate change impacts is incredibly important. So this group, the Tohono O'odham Nation, wanting to have these seeds for identity reasons and cultural reasons is definitely a different reason to want to protect these seeds than what we see today. And so now today it's about, do we have the biodiversity present? Do we have the seeds that are viable in order to address food security as we see more and more warming events, extreme climate events, especially in the southwestern United States? So this becomes really important We need to make sure that the science is accessible, which we can say in the more of the Western science academic framework. Is that information accessible? Not only is that, can these communities have that information, but also is it presented in a way that is understandable to the general public? That becomes then one of our biggest challenges that we have to deal with today. So that's the first example of community engagement. Again, that was some of my older work, but I think it's a beautiful example of how two different groups of people can come together for one main goal. And we can see over time, over decades, how that goal changes. And that really is a focus on food security and climate change. So I'll tell you about this second project here. This is new. I'm currently in my second year of this project. I applied for a Science for Social Equity Fellowship funded by Fair Count. If you're not familiar with Fair Count, Stacey Abrams helped to start Fair Count in Georgia. And this was to address exactly how it sounds, making sure that everyone has a count or a say in either a census or a vote. So that has become really important. And they wanted to have projects that addressed social equity and in various different formats of projects. So what the program is, it pairs a scientist like myself, as well as with a community engager. So someone who does not have my kind of background in science or experimentation, but really has built a career on engaging with the community and knows how to do that. Also, this was a project that needed to be somewhat based on where we lived. As you know, I am at the University of British Columbia. I was in Massachusetts, and I was paired with a community engager who was based in Houston. So perhaps we might expand from Houston and have something that includes Vancouver, British Columbia. We'll have to wait on that. But if you really want to engage the community, it really needs to be, I guess, all hands on deck in a particular location, or at least someone that is familiar with that location. So here we have, there's a QR code in the top right. So if you want to quickly check out Fair Count, and you can see some of these other projects that are there. I can just tell you about where we're at so far and where I see this going. So my partner here is with Brianna Brown. She's the Associate Director of the National Science Policy Network. Really just a fabulous community engager. And something that's incredibly refreshing here for this project is, I think oftentimes academics joke about, well, we had this long meeting, couldn't this have been done in an email? And I have to say, what's refreshing about working with someone who has this kind of background and incredible organization skills, we often have the most productive 15-minute meetings ever. So it can be done. You can do a lot in 15 minutes, especially if you have someone who's incredibly organized. Okay, so we are partnered together. Like I said, Brianna is incredibly fabulous. And here's the background to the story and the project that we're working on. Like all areas of the world, climate change and pollution are now a part of our lives, right? And in this case, Texas has dealt with quite the extreme instances of climate change as well as pollution. So of course, these two things can interact together to create just a devastating situation, especially for various communities, depending on where they are located. So climate change is making Texas hotter. It's threatening public health. Water supply, as you can see here with flooding, flooding is a common issue, even outside of the regular hurricane season. So infrastructure, the state's infrastructure, it becomes the headlines for Texas every time one of these events happen. So you can see on the right here that the change in temperature each decade from 1975 to 2020 in degrees Fahrenheit is dramatically increasing. So this will continue to be a problem for Texas. To address these issues, the Houston offices put together a group to address and develop a climate impact assessment. In August 2020, this was put together, includes various experts and local officials to basically summarize what is the state of Houston, Texas, what are the climate impacts. So lots of things go into reports like that. Again, this is an issue of accessibility as well as science communication. I think this is one of the best examples I've ever seen and worked on, where this is one of the biggest issues and hindrance to working with the community. So to sum up, essentially what Houston is facing, some of the biggest outcomes would be hotter days and nights. So they don't get the cooling effect of nighttime. It's just going to be hot and stay hot. They already have heat waves. They are going to get longer. They already have, devastating hurricane seasons, lots of rainfall. That'll get even worse. And there was a study here, a report from the Johns Hopkins University and Trust for America's Health. You can go to this website based on the QR code there and basically check for every single state in the United States to look at their vulnerability score as well as their preparedness score. Lots of different factors go into the vulnerability score, including social and economic factors, demographics, where they're located, as well as the preparedness. So again, how well are they able to, tackle the issues of various climate change impacts that are incoming? Are they ready for it? Do they have the infrastructure in place? Is the public health going to be impacted here? So different factors go into these different scores that you can check out online. But essentially, to sum up the state, that it is one of the most vulnerable states and also one of the least prepared for the effects of climate change. So obviously a lot of work to do in just this one state. Likely, I would say this is one of the states with, it's so big area-wise and so many different kinds of environments and locations that it really is a huge ordeal for them to undertake. How can they be more prepared and therefore be less vulnerable? And this is important as we kind of pair new other projects and information out there on the perception of the threat of global warming. Now, I'm old enough to remember being a grad student 20 years ago, where I would be on a flight somewhere, maybe likely to a conference or to visit my family. And whoever I was sitting with on an airplane would ask what I do. At the time, I was addressing climate change. How does climate change and global warming affect the physiology of grasses and shrubs in the American Southwest? The biggest question I would get was, you don't really believe in global warming, do you? So that was a question I commonly got. I do not get that question anymore. Of course, there will be those that are denying that is happening. But we even seen with the most recent IPCC report that has been released that the language is even stronger, and that unequivocal. We know what is happening and causing global warming and therefore climate change. So this gets back to a newer project from the Yale program on climate change communication, which has addressed this very issue on the perceptions of the threat. I think what we're starting to see now more about people understanding that it's happening, that it's real, but the perceptions of the threat to them is a very different outcome than what we would expect. So what this group did was a large series of surveys. If you go to the website, you can see the many different types of questions that were asked. And you can look at different, even at the county level, what were the outcomes of these different questions. So what's interesting is there's lots of different outcomes you can see here, but this is about perception and of the threats to each person individually. Well, do they think that global warming will harm them personally? And despite 72% of those surveyed believing that global warming is happening, only 43% of those in Texas believe it will harm them personally. And I just showed you images, the devastating images, and we often see, especially during hurricane season, just with the flooding alone, how harmful these events can be. We now know there is a connection between the severity of hurricanes, the frequency of hurricanes in addition, or as a result of these climate change factors. So perception of threat versus believing that is happening are two different things, and I think also hinders how we can engage communities and move forward here. So what we did as a partnership, myself and Brianna, my community engager partner in Houston, started an initial survey. Now, for the two of us to tackle all of Houston is just a bit much. We don't have a whole crew, a whole organization to help us with this. So we decided to start smaller than just working with the network, a smaller network at first, and then in a way to expand our survey. And so what we wanted to find out was a few different things. I'll give you a couple of examples of our questions from the survey. So based on their experience and current knowledge of environmental issues, what do you believe is the biggest environmental issue in your area? So you can see different aspects here. Surprisingly, flooding wasn't the biggest issue, but as you can see, hurricanes was. So those two can go hand in hand. Sea levels rising, oddly not one of the environmental issues that came up, but climate change in general and pollution are two of the biggest issues that came up. And we also gave them the opportunity to provide their own feedback here. So one issue, there's a Fifth Ward in Houston, arguably one of the most polluted areas in Houston, Texas. Toxic waste dumps in the Fifth Ward was one of the biggest issues noted here. As we know that different neighborhoods, especially those that are underserved and communities of color, tend to suffer the most from toxic waste dumps or environmental hazards or pollution when they are the ones not doing the polluting themselves. So this is a common outcome here. Okay, next question. Based on the issues selected in the previous question, what do you believe are the potential societal impacts associated with that specific environmental issue? So as you can see, this spans everything from just public safety, well-being, economically, what's at stake, access just to basic resources. Again, this is more clear when we have issues such as hurricanes, issues with health. So a couple of other points that came out, lack of necessity and poverty was at the front of their minds, loss of lives in underserved areas. And again, the toxic dumps are located in poor areas. So these kinds of problems are exacerbated in these particular areas. Based on the issues selected in the previous question, what do you believe is the most ideal solution to this problem? And you can see financial support is certainly part of this, but a lot of access to just basic needs, access to information. But perhaps one of the most surprising answers that we saw were policy changes. So what can we do to create real concrete policy change? I think that is the other than science communication and having accessible information, actually effectively creating policy change is one of the other biggest problems that we will face in the climate and nature emergency. So in this case, a couple of issues pointed out here that, again, a lot of these pollution, environmental hazards happening in particular areas, people of color, communities, and though they want accountability for those who are doing the polluting themselves. So illegal dumping continues to happen in these areas. How is that being accounted for and monitored in these particular areas? This is still an issue today. So the offices of Houston put together a Resilient Houston plan. So this is new. It is a very long but beautiful document that has all the different ways in which a city like Houston can be better prepared and be more resilient in the face of future climate change. A lot of this hinges on incoming money to fund changes in infrastructure, improving infrastructure. But as you can see with some of these bullet points here, it also hinges on a very long-term goal. So some things make sense, right? Improving the infrastructure for various modes of transportation. Obviously, that's a ton of money and takes time. But there are some issues, and as we saw in this survey, when we actually communicated with the members of the local community, what they cared about the most will not be addressed by plans like this. And I have colleagues that are based in Houston, and despite seeing a press release, if you do a Google search for this, you can see press releases. Despite that, the general public has no idea that this is happening. So there's a lot of money that went into funding this type of planning. And you can see who funds it, some of the big companies, as well as where's that money going? Does it actually go to the community? Have they actually engaged the community to get their input? The answer is no. So we have this real problem here of actually addressing how public health can be addressed, as well as actually being resilient. So as of October 2021, the report is public and live, but the big questions linger. What's the progress of this initiative? Where's the money going? We don't know. And where is the community engagement? So these are real things that you can have a beautiful plan in place. And we see this in Canada. We see this at the level of the province here in BC. The Sierra Club of BC recently sued the province of British Columbia for some of these reasons, which is not having a real plan in place to address reducing emissions. So we'll probably see more examples of that in the future. So project goals for this, forming partnerships with local experts. This includes campus-based programs. There are already organizations that address some of these. I think it's important to get all of us together and include local experts and local leaders of these organizations. Engaging with community members, we have started to do this. We will continue to do this and expand, improve our survey, as well as address a couple of neighborhoods of Houston. We can't tackle all of Houston, but we definitely plan to interact with community members in essentially kind of like a town hall situation, or panel discussions and one-on-one meetings. The one-on-one meetings actually can be some of the most effective ways to get community input and find out what their needs are and concerns. We also have started to create or have created ways to visualize the impacts of climate change and environmental hazards on the local community. This includes working with graphic designers and illustrators to put together infographics. Also, we are looking to embark on a social media awareness campaign. And we are also putting together an engagement toolkit. So what this means is something that's accessible and palatable to the general public, but it also provides a conduit for the general community to actually be in touch with the local offices. What about the Environmental Protection Agency? The EPA has, under the new Biden administration, has stated that it's their goal to hear more from the community. Well, we want to make sure that there actually is that connection, and that this community in particular is heard because of the vast amount of environmental hazards and pollution that's occurring in some of these neighborhoods. So this is really about providing a platform for them to voice the concerns and needs of the Houston community. So that's the second project. Again, far-reaching implications for this kind of work. I think we'll start to see more examples of this. This really does require not just me, right? I don't feel like I can tackle this alone. I may have the scientific expertise to think about the climate change impacts, but it does take real training and real experience to be an effective community engager. So what we really need are transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary projects that address this, as well as engage with communities. So I'll finish with this third project here. This really spans, is a little bit closer to home in terms of research that I'm familiar with and just how I see my career moving forward. I haven't really addressed to you all what my general research framework is, but I did mention that I studied the impacts of global change on ecosystem health. And what does that mean? Global change can mean changes in the climate, increases in invasive pests and plants, and how those might interact and to impact the health of our various ecosystems. Since I moved from Massachusetts to British Columbia, it wasn't hard to see how the air pollution or air quality was impacted by wildfires that were occurring in that particular area of the world. So now fire is certainly now part of my science framework. And so I think a lot about carbon, how much carbon is being stored in an ecosystem, how much carbon do we lose, and how much carbon goes back out to the atmosphere, therefore is affecting climate change in the future when we have some of these big global change impacts. So one issue I found just with myself in my career, 20 years on this academic path, which is that I really didn't see myself as a Native American scientist. I didn't see other examples or models of Indigenous scientists in my particular area of research. And so what did that mean for me? That meant that I didn't feel that I could be my whole self in an academic setting. I definitely told you earlier about who I am as a Native American and what my perspective was and kind of my approach and family history there. Well, I felt I had to keep that really separate from my science life. And that really affected my happiness, and it affected some of the work I was doing prior to moving to UBC. So I think what ended up happening was I almost left academia. I was definitely doing some soul searching to address this because I wasn't finding that I could be my whole self in this setting. So, but everything worked out. I'm at UBC now. I do feel truly valued and supported in having this holistic approach here. And one of the ways I did this was through my experience at Harvard Forest. I am a research associate at Harvard Forest. If you're not familiar with this research site, it's part of the long-term ecological research network. There are many of these sites funded by the National Science Foundation. They all focus on this field research component, and in particular, long-term ecological research. And so Harvard Forest, of course, under the umbrella of Harvard University, was established in 1907, a 4,000-acre lab and classroom, but it's really the outdoors is the lab here. So the facilities are, I guess, small relative to what you find on the premises there. And of course, scientists from all over the world come to do their research there. In fact, I will be there in 3 weeks to be a part of the summer research experience for undergraduates program. As I mentioned earlier today in my talk, that was the program, although it was in Colorado, but that was the program that really set me on this path to become the scientist that I am today. So it's really fantastic to be able to give back and return to that and be a mentor in the same kind of program. So that's just to give you a little bit of history of how this project started. And excuse me, because I felt like I couldn't be my whole self, I wanted to find a place and a way that I could actually do that. So that brought me to my collaborators, Meg McLean, Clarice Hart, and Marissa Weiss, among others at Harvard Forest, where we're dealing with a really important issue that many different research sites and institutions are dealing with today, which is whose land are you on? And with those Indigenous communities that are there, are these institutions actually interacting with them and addressing some of the land stewardship issues that are happening. So we tried to get funding, Meg McLean and I tried to get funding to reimagine forest ecology and landscape ecology at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. We did not get the funding for that. So we decided to take this project to the summer program. And so this started in 2021. We began interacting with the Nipmuc Nation, which is the land that Harvard Forest is on. And in particular, we were working with Mia Holly. And so this really changed over time. And through this program, because of COVID, we went virtual, just like many other groups did. So this was our life for essentially many months in a virtual setting, having to address and how do we create a project like this. So Faith Blalock on the bottom left and Raphael Viana-Fer on the bottom right are the two REU students that were involved in this virtual REU program from last summer. So this was our life in the virtual setting. And I have to say here as well that before we even brought on the undergrads and started working directly with the Nipmuc Nation, that us as a group of collaborators of Harvard Forest really had to put in a lot of work ahead of time to even begin this process. Even though I am Indigenous, just because of that doesn't mean I can go anywhere and therefore form these relationships easily. There's just a lot of work that needs to go into it, and I need to build those relationships as well. So having added up hours recently, we added it up to just the collaborators alone, 100 hours of meeting time on Zoom before we had the students involved and before we made direct contact with the Nipmuc Nation. That's just it's not the one way to do it, but that was our way. And I think it proved to be effective. So another issue with projects like this is that because if you're working with Indigenous communities, it's important maybe not to necessarily have a timeline, a deadline, or particular things you want to do, because it really is about building those relationships and having the conversations and trying to figure out where are we going with this? What do we want to do here? So I say that, which is because Faith and Rafa, through just our work that summer, found a new way to engage with Indigenous communities as well as the Nipmuc Nation. So here they developed a project called Mapping Pathways to STEM Futures for Indigenous People. What we did was they conducted interviews with various Indigenous scientists in North America, so mostly the United States and Canada. And the list is growing. So, and I won't show the names here, but it really spans various areas in STEM. And they conducted a series of interviews. Each one was slightly tailored to who they were talking with. But there are some questions here that they included in each one of these set of interviews. The first question was, who are you and what do you do? This seems like a really basic question, right? But what they found was that the answers were just so broad and amazing that it really wasn't a basic question. It's a really deep question, how they describe themselves. And it's partly relating to what I've told you about myself. Who has inspired your work, human and non-human, how or why? What helps you to walk in two worlds? The two worlds, like I mentioned to you all, addressing this issue of having this identity and having this path in STEM. How do those two worlds come together if they do come together? Do you think this framework should be institutionalized, meaning the framework of, I guess, walking in these two worlds or having them join together? Should this be part of higher education? Should this be part of organizations? So these are just a few of the questions. They really were, I think, impactful to these students. And to quote one of the students who I asked recently, just to give their thoughts about it, especially in a virtual setting, it's exhausting, right? It can be hard to stay engaged when you're in a virtual setting if you're doing that day in and day out. But for them, they said, we would sometimes go into these meetings exhausted from our work, but then leave with so much positive energy, feeling uplifted. I think these feelings speak a lot to how restorative their knowledge is and can be for Native youth trying to navigate their Indigenous ideas and culture in STEM. So that's really, to me, a impactful statement of how, I guess, energizing this work can be. It's an unusual way, right? We are one of the first, if not the first program to have a project like this, especially a part of the REU program for the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. So this really is, in a sense, groundbreaking in terms of the way we're addressing these environmental questions. So what are we going to do with this? So one of the ways we can address this is by creating narratives from the interviews. In a sense, we're trying to diversify the types of knowledge transfer that are valued in academia, and especially in these types of research settings. So They are in the process of editing the interview transcripts and also in the process of creating or having creative representations of the narratives. As I said, each interview is so unique, and the information that's there can just really blossom into its own beautiful interpretation. So this can be various ways. It could be a poem, it could be in the form of this creative writing or art. And so they are in the process of creating these representations. One example would be here, Rafa on the left here, through their, as a big finale to the RE summer program, they have to have a poster as part of the research symposium. And they wrote a poem, We Persist, as one way to kind of have a creative representation of the work they did over the summer. They are also in the process of creating a website, basically a platform in which to make these narratives accessible. So stay tuned for that. I believe there might be something available this summer. So these two students, as I mentioned, are very much still engaged in this process. They are essentially like TAs or teaching assistants that help us with the next generation of students that are involved here. So we had two winter interns from Harvard joined our family in January 2022. We are about to start the 2022 in-person version of the summer research experience at Harvard Forest. We're very excited about this, to add two new students to the family and having this continued Indigenous community partnerships. A few things on the agenda would be to, in a sense, help establish a farming community, think about sustainable land stewardship and living. So sustainable in terms of just human health, but also economically. There are various land bank initiatives that are occurring in the United States and in Massachusetts. So very early stages for some of this work here. So it's a really exciting time. We'll start to see more projects like this that actually engages the Indigenous community that is there. Again, like I said, we are one of the first programs to do this. So stay tuned. There's no deadline on this. The academic and scientific deadlines and timeline don't match with relationship building. So in a sense, we just kind of have to see where this goes, and perhaps, funding deadlines match with that, and maybe they don't. But that is something, I think transparency is incredibly important here when you want to try to work with Indigenous communities, and just building trust and asking questions and listening. So this really kind of comes full circle for me. I'm able to bring my whole self to develop a holistic approach to climate change adaptation, especially training the next generation of scientists that will address this. Like I said, I have this whole other body of research and related to climate change that I haven't talked about today. I'm happy to answer questions related to that. But today I wanted to focus on 3 examples of how we can actually engage communities to help address climate change. Far too many people to thank, so I just want to put up the major ones here. Right, so Native Sea Search, back in the day when I was working with them, that was a really fantastic way to see behind the scenes of what happens with nonprofit organizations and what happens to funding and how decisions are made, but also engage with the community in a way that my science wasn't allowing me to do. I need to thank Fair Count as well as the other fellows, and especially my community engagement partner, Brianna Brown, for showing me really efficient decision-making processes here, and just having this amazing creative brain to think about how we engage with communities. Especially need to thank Harvard Forest, the Nipmuc Nation, Nia Hawley, Cheryl Hawley, and Kristen Wyman, as well as my collaborators and the students involved in this project. And with that, I will stop sharing and take all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. You have also a very nice presentation. I really enjoyed your many photographs. I would like to begin with some questions of clarification or comprehension, because it's our second language. And someone asked, what does first or third ward mean?
Yeah, these are different. These are just different neighborhoods, like in a sense. Yeah. So they kind of pieced in all these different areas. So, like I said, Houston, a really huge city, and we can't possibly tackle all the neighborhoods. So that's just two of the neighborhoods, but they're two of the most polluted neighborhoods.
Okay. And we had a question: is the Naya Holley a forest or an ecological area in general?
I think was the question, is Nia Hawley the Nipmuc Nation person we work with, is she a scientist? Was that the question?
Yeah, if it's yeah.
Yeah, so this is really neat. So we had contacted the Nipmuc Nation, and of course it's, as most Indigenous communities are facing lots of requests for input or engagement on projects. And so I think what typically happens is you have a representative or a designated representative that's agreed upon by tribal leaders and councils. So that's what led to this, and that she's an artist, actually. She's a really wonderful artist, thinks a lot about, I guess, land stewardship and what it takes to really, in a sense, have a sustainable living. So that is the person we first started with. She was also engaged with another project at Harvard Forest, which is based off of the museum that's there. There is a museum that has a series of dioramas. And as a lot of museums or series like this start with colonialism and exclude the entire history of what happened before then. So Harvard Forest is also in this process of kind of reimagining what that means when we think about land use history. And so that's how we first got in touch with Nia. And then over time, it's expanded to other members, other leaders of the Nipmuc Nation. And so it's been really exciting. We've come a long way in just 2 years.
Yeah, well, sadly, I think European museums or Hamburgian museums have to learn much about the colonial history. I think it's very, well, change is coming, hopefully. We also have the question, what is a land back initiative? Do you have an example, maybe? Maybe you can use it in a sentence.
Right. I guess if we think about whose land we're on, and if we think about history and what's happened, the reduction of land for all these different Indigenous communities, well, they've gotten some of it back. And that there are many examples of that in the United States. And, some of it, hinges on lawsuits. The Coeur d'Alene has an example as well. We don't own, history showed that the lake was part of our lands, but that we don't own all of it. Now it's divided into a third and 2/3. So we have a good portion of the lake, but of course that's very fluid, right? That's not as distinct as 400 acres, but at least part of it, we have a good portion of the lake back. Of course, that's after filing a lawsuit. So some of it hinges on doing work like that. In other cases, there's just real legislation in place to help move that forward.
What a nice answer, because we will have in 2 weeks a lecture series on the necessity of laws. Sorry for my English. Another question was, how do local farmers react to your research? Is there any outreach or translating or for the communication of science to Indigenous people and or other farmers? Maybe you can tell something from your research fieldwork.
Yeah, I think that is slower to move forward than I would hope. I think in general, there's obvious connections there. And I think it's just over time, we'll see more and more get involved. But I I do think there's such a long history of research showing how, I guess, like, how do we feed the world, right? And how expensive that is, and kind of environmentally harming that can be. And so now in the US, I mean, I've noticed a lot more focus on farm to table, local, locally sourcing your food, and and appreciating and buying from local farmers. I think that has come a long way. And now addressing kind of indigenous communities in that way, I still have a long way to go. I hear one of the issues is a recent issue was, I guess the different berries that can be important for different indigenous communities are being sprayed because of trying to, for maybe the industry, forest industry, and they're trying to get rid of the berries. But those are really important, those are really important plants and species for different groups. So that's tragic. So we'll see healthy examples and yet really bad examples like that. So I think we have a ways to go, but I think one thing that ties everyone together is thinking about the soil, thinking about restoration and conservation, thinking about invasive species and biodiversity. I think I'm seeing a merging of those concepts. So yeah, we definitely need more of those communities coming together, though.
We have a direct link to another question, nämlich, are there any attempts of and difficulties with connecting the ecological knowledge of indigenous people with the academia scientific approach?
Yeah, this will be one of the biggest challenges we'll face. I can say this. I think different areas of the world have progressed differently, and that one of the reasons I'm at the University of British Columbia is because I think they are a leader in this way, and far ahead of different institutions that I've been at in the past in the United States. So again, this kind of ties back to what I was saying, not feeling like I could have my identity be valued in this scientific process, and I don't feel that here. I feel very much valued and supported here. In general, I think there's this great leadership and initiatives in place to help kind of foster, those kinds of interactions and projects. A challenge is, and this is happening here as well as other institutions, is how to value different forms of knowledge transfer. And what do I mean by that? I mean, academia has a very rigid, rigid way of addressing productivity, right? And, you have a famous scientist, and because they publish a lot and get grants, right? And so surely I think that probably won't go away, but I think diversifying how we value, different scholars and experts will change. And in this case, storytelling, the diversity, equity, inclusion work, community engagement, how does that get valued? So I think we're starting to see changes. Of course, that requires turnover. And having newer faculty come in, newer ideas, and embracing of that. So change is slow for sure on that, but I would say where I'm at is a good place and a leader in that way.
How much do you think has research changed, the research on climate change in the past maybe 20 years? Because you told us it has changed or will change more. You saw it change.
Yeah, and I'm in a unique field, as a ecophysiologist, or as a plant physiological ecologist is another way to kind of define, I guess, my specialty. And that was a very interdisciplinary field. It still is. And so I think it's taken, I would say, folks that are in very kind of rigid areas, STEM fields, that I think they were like slow to come around to the idea of an interdisciplinary field like ecophysiology. Like, what is this? Well, why measure at the ecosystem level? Why do we care what happens at the ecosystem level? So I would say, 20 years ago that, and maybe it still happens a little bit today, that there's this real disconnect of science and understanding, and that maybe someone who works at the cellular level or genetics level doesn't understand why we'd want to understand ecosystem health. Of course, I don't understand that. I can see the value in what they do, and hopefully it's reciprocal. But I would say 20 years ago, that was very present. That was a very palpable issue of not understanding each other's scale of research. And over time, I think we've seen this, and we see this with funding agencies, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, USGS, USDA, that the funding has moved in a way where it wants interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects, because look where we've come. We've had all of these different fields and specialties and disciplines in STEM, yet we have not fully solved anything. We have some ideas, better predictions. The science has done a fabulous job of predicting climate change and how, I guess. But like, how do we have solutions, and how do we understand how to mitigate these things and adapt to it and be resilient? That has been the issue. So I would say it's changed to be much more of accepting of this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary mode of thinking. I think we'll just see more of that. I think we'll just see like really interesting combinations of disciplines to help address these issues.
I mean, that's why we are doing this lecture series, to have these trends. But very nice. Thank you for your answer. We have another question because I will just read it out. I did not get the main idea of Harvard Forest project. I would like to know, could you maybe repeat or sum up the main idea of the Harvard Forest project again? Because, yeah.
Yeah, and that's somewhat on purpose, which is that it's all about relationship building. And like I said, I was trying to convey the idea that there's no end date to that project, and that it just will always evolve. And it's because the goal is to build that relationship. The goal is to have this respectful, reciprocal relationship with the local Indigenous community, and in order to do whatever they need or want. And so that requires conversations, right? And relationship building that trust. So I would say that is one of the points of the project. And again, this kind of speaks to, in an academic setting, we try to have outcomes, right? Oh, we're going to have a peer-reviewed research paper that addresses this experiment at the end of the summer. And that's not the case with these kinds of projects. And so we are, this summer, like, we're planning various things to address invasive species. We're addressing accessibility to species that are culturally important. We are thinking about ways to merge art and science so that we can better communicate and engage with the public. So these would be some of the important reasons or points of the project. It also, I would say, the main driving force behind this kind of partnership is to diversify how science is done and how we view land use history. This requires a whole other talk and issue of like thinking about land use history at a site like Harvard Forest and what the issues are. We don't have time to talk about that, but it has not included Indigenous voices. So what we are trying to amplify and include those now.
I really much enjoyed your answer, because it's a very capitalistic approach to academia to have like a product at the end to present, But I have a follow-up question for that. how do you come in contact with people who aren't interested in your work anyway? So maybe people who have never been into academia, more or less, maybe went to high school or something like that.
So what's the question? How do I address people that, or yeah, maybe could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so how do you come in contact with people who aren't interested anyways? So maybe people who have always worked on the field but never have as much read a book about climate change, or I mean, I don't want to reproduce stereotypes, but these are realities. How do we connect with each other and, learn from each other? What's your approach? How is your method?
Yeah, and I think that's true. Like, even when I talk about engaging with the community, whether it's communities of color or any community or Indigenous communities, there is still that barrier with some scientists in the academic setting that just don't value that, and perhaps never will. And in that case, I I guess, like a talk like I gave today, I hope that shows why that's important and how we haven't come as far as we need to address the climate emergency. And therefore we should change our approach, right? If we keep doing the same approach, where does that really get us? And so, and also I think it becomes personal, right? I think like this, going back to the example, perception of the threat of global warming or climate change or environmental hazards, it's hard to make that connection that for some people that, oh, this is a problem for me, until it becomes a personal problem, right? And that, oh, I was in a hurricane, or I lost my house because of the hurricane, and or flooding, or different things like that. So I think it's partly is finding those connections, right? Finding the way to make it personal, and so that people care. So hopefully there will be plenty more examples that I think show how important that is.
Let's keep it personal. We have a question. When was the first time you had realized, or the feeling that this is being a climate or environmental emergency and you have to do something? Do you know that point of time?
Yeah, it was when I was an undergrad. I was an undergrad at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I was majoring, it was called zoology at the time, but it was basically a general biology major. I also minored in environmental studies. And it was through those courses, it was really clear to me, everything that we were reading, and just kind of this disconnect of like how we were living and what we were reading, and the disconnect from nature, right? And so there, just taking courses and learning about pollution. And, I was reading classic books like Rachel Carson's book, or A Silent Spring, and other books based in conservation. And so those were really transformative for me, just having read those, and seeing. Back then it was, DDT as this chemical that's being sprayed to get rid of mosquitoes or other bugs, and yet it stayed in the system and killed all these organisms up the food chain. And so to me, it was just having those concrete examples. I was like, whoa, we need to do something. It just, to me, it was really obvious taking courses. And that was late 1990s. So I'm aging myself here, but that's, yeah, it was really clear to me then. And the science, because I was immersed in a research or various research labs, and you have to kind of do a literature search or annotated bibliography and reading about it, I could just see, like any other scientist, you can see the past, because you can analyze the past data, and then we have a world full of amazing scientists who model, can make predictive, hypotheses based on models. And, they could see it. They saw it. Here's what the data was, and let's put this into this model and try to predict what's going to happen. And it kept happening, right? So I thought you kind of can imagine how, oh, well, this is a model. Okay, is this real? Is this really good at predicting? And then a few years later, you see, oh, actually, it was really great at predicting this change. And then you see many more of those. So I would say when I was a grad student is when I became, I mean, I was concerned as an undergrad. In grad school, I could just see the science happening. And here we are decades later that it happened, but much faster than we thought it would. So I think we keep seeing that now. So I'm incredibly alarmed about the outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for your personal answer. We have also the question, what are examples of current research project of yours considering biodiversity, invasive species, and forests? Maybe you can elaborate on that, because we have a few minutes left. You have time.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I definitely encourage folks to go to my website to hear more about it or read papers. But to summarize, I think one of my biggest projects that I've worked on that addresses this is we have eastern hemlock forests. There are many different types of hemlock tree species, but I was in the Northeast, right? I was in Massachusetts, and we have the eastern hemlock tree. It's a foundation tree species, meaning that it has a very special role in the environment, very particular types of species, avian species, ants, columbalins, anthropods, things like that have a special need to be in an environment with the eastern hemlock tree. So it's a very special tree species. It also creates a really unique environment. There's not much of an understory in these forest stands, partly because it has such a dense canopy, not a light comes through. So it's shadier, it's cooler its temperatures are cooler. And because of the composition of the needles, they're very acidic, and it's an evergreen conifer tree. So because of that, the composition of the needles need to be as such to withstand the environment throughout the year. So when those needles do fall to the ground, there's not an understory. It's hard to decompose that leaf material. So we get this huge buildup of the soil organic layer. And so nothing decomposes very quickly. We have a cool, shady environment, a buildup of soil organic layer, and slow decomposition, low nutrient availability. But it has a very unique role in the environment to help diversity for other organisms. And what we have now is this invasive pest, the hemlock woolly adulgit, in the early 1950s, arrived in the Northeast United States, spread quickly, decimated whole stands of eastern hemlock within 5 to 7 years, and it just continues to travel north. So what ends up happening, and we have sites that just show complete transformation. We lose all that eastern hemlock. We typically have black birch stands replace it. And black birch is a deciduous tree species. So it loses all its leaves in the fall. Very different type of tree. Very different outcome on that soil organic layer. So what we've been able to show is that looking at different stands of forests, we have been able to show what happens when you lose eastern hemlocks and transition to black birch stands. What does that mean for carbon storage and climate change? And what it means is that eastern hemlocks have an incredible ability to store carbon because of that soil organic layer. So not only are they big, massive trees and stands of forests, but because of that built up soil organic layer that doesn't decompose very quickly, it stores a lot of carbon and is a sink for CO2. But when they die off because of this invasive species, they transition to a deciduous stand. That soil organic layer decomposes quickly and we lose all that carbon. It goes back out to the atmosphere, and therefore the system becomes a source for CO2. So in a sense, on a landscape level, we have just this huge, massive contribution to global warming and climate change.
Well, thank you very much. We would have a last question. It's very complicated, and maybe you can just imagine some answers. What do you think would be the most important political decisions to be made now to counteract the current mass extinction? I don't know if you have an answer for that, but maybe you can try.
That's a big question. Gosh. Reducing emissions would be, reducing emissions, I think is going to be the biggest challenge. And I think where a lot of emphasis should be protecting different ecosystems that already exist. I will just say, like, old growth forests, reducing just whole clear cutting, and finding ways to maintain biodiversity and maintain these ecosystems that have the ability to store carbon. Because if we can reduce emissions and reduce the warming, then ecosystems like peatlands, which store a huge amount of carbon, if that gets released to the atmosphere, there's just no way to stop the acceleration. So I think reducing the emissions is at the forefront for me, but also protecting these healthy and long-term, growth, these old growth forests and ecosystems like that store a lot of carbon.
Okay, thank you very much. I would say we would come to the end of this lecture series. I thank everybody for tuning in. And then, we always have like an after meeting to speak without audience. And we will send you a link. Maybe you have like a few minutes, 10 minutes.
Yes, just if you have time, I will send it to your university email.
Okay.
Yeah, sure, no problem. And thank you so much for staying logged on and listening. Thank you for inviting me.
Can you see the chat? The students are also thanking you. Okay.
See a little bit.
Yeah.